The ash was a fine grey powder that clung to everything, a ghost shroud over the memory of a life. Anya knelt and let it run through her fingers, the last tangible piece of the home she had shared with her husband. It was soot, bone dust, and the pulverized charcoal of their shared dreams. All gone in a single night of rogue fire, a careless spark from a world that had moved on without her. The only things left were the stone foundation, a blackened testament to permanence, and the dog, Fenris, whose warm, solid weight pressed against her back. He was a constant, breathing anchor in the swirling tide of her grief. He whined softly, a low rumble in his deep chest, nudging her hand with his nose. The land was all they had. A patch of hard-scrabble earth that grudgingly gave up potatoes and withered corn, bordered by a dense forest of pine and unforgiving granite. It was a poor inheritance, now made poorer by the gaping wound where their cabin had stood. The townsfolk in Havenwood had offered their condolences, their pity a thin gruel she could not stomach. They offered a room in a boarding house, a charity that felt like a cage. She had refused, her voice a dry rasp. This land was hers. This ruin was hers. The silence that followed her husband's passing was now a physical presence, a heavy blanket woven with the scent of pine and cold stone. She looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, its blue a cruel mockery of the vibrant life that had once filled this space. Fenris rested his great head on her lap, his amber eyes fixed on her face, waiting for a command that she did not know how to give. Where did one go from here? The foundation stones were cold beneath her hands. The world had shrunk to this small, desolate clearing and the silent, watchful woods that surrounded it. She was an island of sorrow in a sea of trees, and the tide of winter was coming in. Mr. Roth approached on his fine horse, the animal's polished leather tack creaking with an air of prosperity that was an insult to the scorched earth. He dismounted with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned much and wanted more, his boots leaving clean, decisive prints in the ash. Fenris rose, a low growl vibrating in his throat, but Anya placed a calming hand on his ruff. Roth surveyed the ruin, his lips pursed in a look of distaste, as if her tragedy were a personal inconvenience to him. He did not offer condolences. He offered practicality, which to him was the highest form of virtue. A terrible business, Anya, he began, his voice smooth and oiled as his saddle. A true shame. But you must look forward. A woman alone, with winter on its way, this is no place for you. The land is fallow, the cabin is gone. There is nothing here but memory and hardship. He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle. I am prepared to make you an offer. A fair price for the acreage. Enough for you to get a clean start in a proper town, perhaps back east where things are more civilized. You could find work, a small room. It is the sensible thing to do. There is no point clinging to a ghost. His gaze swept over her, taking in her soot-stained dress, her drawn face, the fierce, protective stance of the dog beside her. His offer was not kindness, it was a transaction designed to tidy up a messy corner of his expanding map. He saw a problem to be erased, a parcel of land to be absorbed. He did not see the woman who had buried her husband on the rise behind the ruin, the woman whose hands had planted every struggling stalk of corn in the field. He saw only an obstacle. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the blackened stones of her hearth. No, she said. The word was small, but it was solid, a stone dropped into a still pond. Roth blinked, unused to refusal. No? My dear woman, you must not let sentiment cloud your judgment. What will you do? You cannot live in a pile of ash. The first snows will be here in a month. You will freeze. You and that beast. My offer is more than generous. It is a lifeline. His voice was laced with a condescending pity that pricked at her more than any overt cruelty could. I am not selling my land. Her voice was firmer now, her gaze lifting to meet his. It was a flat, unyielding statement. There was no room for negotiation in it. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw and sighed, a gust of impatient air. Then you are a fool, he said, the veneer of civility cracking. You will die here. And for what? For dirt and dust. When the frost takes you, remember that I tried to help. He turned and swung himself back into the saddle, a man retreating from an illogical and frustrating situation. he spurred his horse, churning the grey ash into a small, resentful cloud as he rode away, leaving Anya and Fenris alone once more in the profound silence of their desolation, her quiet defiance echoing in the empty air. In the days that followed, a profound aimlessness settled over her. She and Fenris walked the boundaries of her land, a silent, two-body procession marking the edges of her world. The dog stayed close, a shadow of fur and muscle, his presence a constant, unspoken comfort. The woods were deep and old, the pines rising like the pillars of a forgotten cathedral. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, a scent that mirrored the hollowness inside her. It was on one of these somber patrols that they found it. Deep in the oldest part of the forest, where the light struggled to pierce the dense canopy, lay a fallen giant. A colossal pine, ancient and gnarled, that must have been struck by lightning a generation ago. Its scale was breathtaking. The root ball, ripped from the earth, was a tangled fortress of soil and stone and wood, taller than two men. The trunk stretched on and on into the gloom, wider than a horse was long, a great spine of a slain beast laid out upon the forest floor. Moss grew over it in thick, verdant blankets, and ferns sprouted from its crevices. To any other eye, it was a monument to death, a slow return to the earth. A grave. Fenris approached it cautiously, sniffing at the exposed roots, his tail low. Anya followed, her boots sinking into the soft loam. She ran a hand over the bark, its texture rough and deeply fissured, like the skin of some primeval reptile. She walked its length, her small frame dwarfed by its immense girth. Near the base, where the lightning had struck, the initial blast and subsequent years of rot had hollowed out a section of the trunk, creating a dark, cavernous opening. It was this darkness that drew her in. She peered inside, the air cool and smelling of rich, damp wood and thyme. It was not an empty void. It was a space. A shelter. A quiet, unbidden thought, fragile as a moth's wing, fluttered in the back of her mind. She dismissed it as madness, a fancy born of grief and desperation. But the thought returned, more insistent this time. She looked at the ruin of her home, then back at the fallen tree. One was a monument to what was lost. The other was a possibility. She saw the sheer thickness of the wooden walls, a bulwark against any wind, any snow. She saw the earth packed around its base, a natural insulation. She saw the root ball, a towering bulwark that could break the fiercest blizzard. It was not a grave. It was a promise. It was a challenge. Fenris, sensing the shift in her, came to her side and looked from the log's dark mouth back to her face, as if awaiting a new purpose. A spark of defiance, the one that had answered Mr. Roth, flared into a tiny, warming flame within her chest. They had called her a fool for staying. They would surely call her mad for this. Let them. Madness was better than despair. She had tools. She had strength. She had the long, empty days. She had a dog who trusted her. She had a giant. The work began at dawn the next day. Anya returned to the fallen pine not with grief in her heart, but with a quiet, ferocious purpose. She carried her husband's tools, a heavy felling axe, its edge worn but keen, a broad-headed adze for shaping wood, and a sturdy shovel. They felt solid and real in her hands, instruments of creation, not mourning. Fenris trotted beside her, his tail held high now, sensing the change in the air, the new energy that radiated from her. Her first task was to widen the opening. The wood at the edges was punky and soft from years of exposure, but deeper in, it became solid, resinous heartwood, the color of dried blood. She swung the axe, the rhythmic thump a new heartbeat in the silent forest. The blows jarred her arms, sending vibrations up into her shoulders, but the pain was a welcome distraction. It was a feeling of effort, of action, a stark contrast to the helpless inertia that had held her captive. Each chip of wood that flew was a small victory against the encroaching despair. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Her world shrank to the smell of pine sap, the ache in her back, and the growing hollow in the log. She cleared the rotted pith from the center, shoveling out bucket after bucket of damp, fragrant mulch, which she piled against the outside of the log, adding to its insulation. Fenris would watch her for hours, a sentinel perched on the massive trunk, his ears twitching at every forest sound. Sometimes he would dig alongside her, his powerful paws sending showers of dirt and wood pulp flying, a partner in her strange, monumental task. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and hard. Blisters formed, broke, and healed into tough new skin. Ache settled deep into her bones, a constant reminder of the sheer physical will required to carve a home from the heart of a dead tree. She learned the grain of the wood, where it was weak and where it was unyielding. She worked until exhaustion forced her to stop, then she would sit with her back against the log, sharing a piece of dry bread with Fenris, the two of them watching the light fade through the canopy. There was no one to witness her labor, no one to offer encouragement or scorn. There was only the forest, the dog, and the slow, arduous transformation of a fallen giant into a sanctuary. It was a primal, solitary struggle, a conversation between her own stubborn resilience and the immense, silent patience of the wood. The interior space grew slowly, inch by painstaking inch. She did not carve it smooth or attempt any artistry, she was a creature burrowing, seeking only shelter. The adze became an extension of her arm, its curved blade scooping out charred and softened wood, shaping a space just large enough for her and Fenris and a small fire. The floor was the earth itself, which she packed down until it was hard and level. The walls were the rough-hewn, curving interior of the great log, the wood a deep, rich red, weeping fragrant sap that smelled of life and endurance. She discovered a natural chimney of sorts, a fissure in the wood near the top of the trunk created by the lightning strike. With immense effort, she cleared it of debris, using a long pole to push out squirrel nests and old leaves until a narrow shaft of light pierced the gloom. This would be her flue. She spent a week gathering flat, heavy stones from the nearby creek bed, hauling them one by one on her back. She used them to build a small, careful hearth directly beneath the fissure, sealing the stones together with a thick paste of clay and mud from the creek bank. It was rudimentary, ugly, but functional. While she worked, Mr. Hemlock, the owner of Havenwood's Mercantile, rode out to check on her. He found her covered in sawdust and grime, emerging from the dark maw of the log like some forest spirit. He stared, his mouth agape, at the piles of excavated wood and the stone hearth. "Anya? Good Lord, woman, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice a mixture of alarm and genuine concern. He had brought a small sack of flour and some salted bacon, charity she had been too proud to ask for but was too hungry to refuse. She simply wiped a smudge of dirt from her brow with the back of her hand. "Building my home," she replied, her voice even. He shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the absurd, magnificent project. This is madness. You cannot live in a tree. Let the town help you. We can have a small cabin raised for you before the first snow." He meant it kindly, his concern a soft, warm thing compared to Roth's cold pragmatism. But his words still carried the sting of disbelief. He saw a broken woman engaged in a desperate, foolish fantasy. He did not see the architect of her own survival. "I have a home," she said, gesturing to the log. "Thank you for the flour," Mr. Hemlock. Her quiet finality left no room for argument. He left the provisions and rode away, shaking his head, his heart heavy with pity for the poor widow who had clearly lost her mind along with everything else. The first snows came not as a gentle dusting but as a sharp, biting precursor to the season's temper. The air grew a crystalline edge, and the wind began to speak with a deeper, more menacing voice. Anya worked with a frantic urgency now, the colder whip at her back. She gathered fallen branches and pine cones, creating a massive pile of fuel near the entrance of her log home. She used moss and clay to chink every crack and crevice in the log's exterior, sealing her shelter against the coming onslaught. The entrance was a dark opening, and she fashioned a crude door from a wide piece of bark and animal hide, heavy enough to block the wind but easy enough to move aside. Fenris seemed to sense the change as well. He rarely strayed from the log, often lying just inside the entrance, his nose to the wind, testing the air for the scent of the deep cold. As the world outside turned bleak and grey, her burrow became a repository of warmth and life. Mr. Roth made one final visit. He did not dismount this time, his impatience a palpable aura around him. He saw the wisp of smoke curling from the fissure in the log, saw the primitive door, and his face hardened with disgust. "Still here, I see," he called out, his voice sharp with contempt. "Living like a badger in a hole. I have a buyer for the adjacent parcel, and your situation is becoming an embarrassment. This is my final offer. Half of what I proposed before. Take it and be gone before you are buried here." Anya emerged from the log, her face smudged with soot, her eyes clear and steady. The cold air turned her breath into a white plume. She looked at the man on his fine horse, a man whose world was built of fences and deeds and coin, and she felt not anger, but a profound distance. They did not inhabit the same reality. He saw a worthless hovel. She saw the heart of a fortress. "I am home," she said. It was the only answer she had, and the only one he would ever need. He sneered. "Have it your way. Nature will pass its own judgment on your foolishness." He wheeled his horse around and was gone, a dark figure retreating into the grey landscape. That night, the wind began to howl in earnest. The world outside her log became a maelstrom of white. Anya built up the small fire in her stone hearth, the flames casting a warm, dancing light on the curved wooden walls. She and Fenris curled up together on a bed of pine boughs and old blankets, and for the first time in months, she felt safe. The storm that descended was not merely a blizzard, it was a siege. The locals would later call it the Great Freeze, a winter that would become a dark benchmark in the town's memory. The wind shrieked like a hungry predator, a physical force that scoured the landscape and tore at the very bones of the houses in Havenwood. Snow fell not in flakes but in a blinding, horizontal torrent, burying fences and paths, piling in monstrous drifts against doors and walls. The temperature plummeted into a realm of profound, killing cold, a cold that cracked trees and froze creeks solid to their beds. Inside the log, the storm was a distant rumor. The howling of the wind was a dull, muted roar, its fury broken by the sheer, unyielding mass of the ancient pine. The thick wooden walls, inches and inches of solid heartwood, held the cold at bay. The snow, rather than being a threat, became an ally, piling over and around the log, burying it completely, adding a thick, pristine blanket of insulation. Anya and Fenris were entombed in a cocoon of quiet warmth. The small fire in the stone hearth needed only a little fuel to keep the space comfortable. The smoke drew perfectly up the fissure, a thin, almost invisible plume on the surface of the snowdrift above. She had her stores, the flour and bacon from Mr. Hemlock, dried herbs, a small sack of potatoes she had managed to harvest. It was not a feast, but it was enough. She would listen to the muffled rage of the world outside and feel a deep, resonant sense of peace. She had not defied nature, she had listened to it. She had found its strength and made it her own. The log, which the world saw as a symbol of death and decay, had become an ark. The wind could not touch them. The cold could not find them. In the heart of the storm, in the belly of the fallen giant, she and her dog were safe, breathing the warm, pine-scented air, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady, sleeping breath of her companion. It was a vindication that needed no audience, a triumph measured in the simple, profound currency of survival. In Havenwood, the Great Freeze was a catastrophe. The town was built of hastily erected clapboard and poorly chinked logs, structures designed for ordinary winters, not for this elemental assault. The wind found every crack, every seam, pouring cold into homes like a physical substance. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their woodpiles at a terrifying rate. The sound of the storm was a constant, nerve-shredding scream. After 2 days, the fear began to curdle into panic. Windows, where they existed, were opaque with thick frost, sealing the people in a dim, twilight world. The cold was relentless, seeping through floors, chilling rooms to the point where breath turned to ice in the air. Mr. Hemlock, in his mercantile, watched his own stores of firewood dwindle. He could hear the desperate sounds of his neighbors, the splintering of furniture being broken up for fuel. He thought of Roth, safe and warm in his large, well-built house on the edge of town, insulated by his wealth. And then, his thoughts turned again to the widow. The madwoman in her log. He had pitied her, been so certain of her demise. But his certainty was a fragile thing now, shattered by the overwhelming power of the storm. He remembered the thickness of that fallen tree. He remembered the wisp of smoke, the look of calm resolve on her face. What he had seen as madness, a desperate folly, began to reconfigure in his mind. What if it wasn't madness? What if it was a different kind of wisdom, a knowledge that the town, with its straight lines and tidy cabins, had forgotten? The thought was a small, improbable spark, but in the desperate cold, it was enough. He had to know. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, pulled a heavy wool cap down over his ears, and told his wife he was going out. "You can't," she cried. "The storm will take you." But the image of Anya's quiet face, of her strange, earthen home, compelled him. He had to see if the fool had somehow outsmarted them all. He pushed open his door against a wall of snow and stepped into the shrieking, white chaos of the storm. The journey was a brutal pilgrimage. The wind tore at Mr. Hemlock, stealing his breath and blinding him with ice crystals. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, clinging morass that fought him with every step. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him, and he navigated by memory and instinct, his world reduced to a swirling vortex of white and the burning in his lungs. Several times he fell, the cold seeping into him instantly, a lethargy that whispered of the sweet, final peace of freezing. But the image of Anya's log home drove him forward. It was a beacon in his mind's eye. He found the edge of her property, recognizing the line of stalwart pines that bordered her land. He pushed into the woods, the trees offering a slight reprieve from the wind's full fury. He was exhausted, his limbs numb, his hope failing. And then he saw it. Or rather, he saw the mound. A massive, elongated drift of snow, from which a single, impossibly thin ribbon of grey smoke rose to dissolve into the blizzard. He stumbled towards it, calling Anya's name, his voice swallowed by the storm. He found the depression in the snow that marked her entrance and saw the hide flap, weighted down with a stone. He pulled it aside and almost fell into the space beyond. The transition was staggering. The screaming wind vanished, replaced by a profound, enveloping silence. The biting cold was gone, replaced by a gentle, steady warmth. His eyes, accustomed to the blinding white, slowly adjusted to the dim, flickering light of a small, contained fire. He saw Anya, sitting by the hearth, and the great dog, who rose to his feet with a low growl. She looked at him, not with surprise, but with a quiet, knowing calm. The air was dry and smelled of wood smoke and pine. It was not just shelter, it was a sanctuary. It was a living, breathing space, warm and secure in the heart of the apocalypse. "She's alive," he breathed, the words misting in the warm air. He looked at the curving wooden walls, the earthen floor, the simple genius of it all. His pity for her turned to awe. She had not been mad. She had been visionary. He turned, his mind reeling. "Others," he gasped, his chest heaving. "The town, they're freezing." Anya simply nodded, her expression unchanged. She added a small piece of wood to the fire. Her silence was not a question, it was an answer. Mr. Hemlock did not stay long. He warmed himself for a few precious minutes, the heat sinking into his bones like a benediction, and then he plunged back into the storm, his return journey fueled by a desperate, miraculous hope. He fought his way back to Havenwood, a messenger from a world of impossible warmth. He burst into the nearest cabin, where two families were huddled together under a pile of blankets, their fire nothing but dying embers. "She's alive," he shouted over the wind. "The widow. She has a place. It's warm." At first, they stared at him as if he were the one who was mad. But the conviction in his voice, the frantic hope in his eyes, was undeniable. Word spread like wildfire through the freezing town. A small, desperate exodus began. Led by Hemlock, a group of about a dozen people, men, women, and shivering children, stumbled through the blizzard, a ragged line of survivors clinging to a thread of hope. They followed him into the woods, to the great mound of snow. One by one, they pushed aside the hide flap and entered Anya's sanctuary. The effect was the same for each of them. Their faces, pinched and blue with cold, slackened with disbelief as the warmth enveloped them. Their eyes widened as they took in the impossible reality of the hollow log. They saw Anya, her calm presence at the center of it all, and the great, watchful dog at her side. No one spoke. The awe was too profound. They simply found a place on the earthen floor, huddling together, soaking in the life-giving heat. Anya met their gazes without triumph or reproach. She had not built this place for them, but now that they were here, they were welcome. She was no longer the mad widow, the object of their pity. She was their savior. She moved quietly, making a thin broth with some of her dried herbs and a little flour, sharing the little she had. Fenris, after an initial period of wary observation, seemed to accept the newcomers, settling back down by the fire, a silent, furry guardian. In the belly of the fallen giant, amidst the fury of the Great Freeze, a new community was forged, born not of law or commerce, but of shared vulnerability and the quiet, stubborn wisdom of a woman who had refused to be broken. They were warmed by her fire, sheltered by her folly, and humbled by her strength.